is John Williams wrote the book on film scoring. Then Hans Zimmer took that book, set it on fire, and played a synth solo while it burned. John Williams taught us how film scores should sound, but Hans Zimmer taught us how they could sound. Before Hans Zimmer became a household name in the industry, film music was all about big orchestra, sweeping strings, blaring horns, huge drums. But Hans Zimmer, with his love for synthesizers, brought a new element to film scoring. Hans Zimmer used ambient pads, arpeggios, textures, pulsating rhythms in his music, and they were nothing like we've ever heard before in the world of film scoring. When Hans Zimmer scores a film, you don't just hear it, you feel it. This is the man who made time tick in Inception, who made space feel infinite in Interstellar, and who delivered chaos in The Dark Knight. Over 150 films, multiple awards, and a sound that redefined cinema. This is Hans Zimmer, and these are his top 5 greatest scores of all time. At number 5 is The Lion King. One of the greatest animated movies of all time and one of the greatest scores of all time. For Lion King, Hans Zimmer blended African traditional music with Western instrumentations. He didn't just write a score, he created a cultural soundscape. From the very first frame, that iconic chant sets the tone for a magnificent score that symbolizes the African culture. Hans was initially reluctant to score the film, but the story of Simba's loss actually reminded him of his father, and he took on the project and wrote the score as a tribute to his father, who he lost when he was only 6 years old. The result is a deeply emotional score that is fit for a film that could be a Shakespearean tragedy. The score, just like the movie, was critically acclaimed, and it won Hans Zimmer his first Oscar. At number 4, Dune. When Denis Villeneuve, the director of Dune, approached Hans Zimmer for this movie, Hans was ecstatic because Dune was his favorite novel growing up. And for Dune, Hans Zimmer went all out. He never wanted to create a score that sounded just like all the other sci-fi movies. He actually wanted the audience to be transported to another planet, and he wanted to create sounds that were otherworldly. For this movie, Hans built custom instruments, used heavily processed vocals as textures, and recorded chants in a new language. This movie is sound design and composition merged into one. Hans was telling us that this is how music would sound like on Arrakis, and this movie earned Hans his second Oscar. At number 3, Gladiator. What we do echoes in eternity. That's the famous line from the movie Gladiator. And just like the movie, Hans Zimmer's scores will always echo in eternity. It is beautiful, emotional, and epic. For the movie Gladiator, Hans worked with Lisa Gerrard, the vocalist, and created a score that almost sounds spiritual. Whenever we talk about epic historical period movies, the score of Gladiator always comes as a reference point. The story revolves around a Roman general who was imprisoned and turned into a gladiator. The improvised vocal phrases sung by Lisa Gerrard still haunt us to this day, and nobody can forget the epic battle scenes in the Colosseum. The score is typical Hans Zimmer. The reason why this score stands out is because instead of going big, Hans Zimmer went small. The tracks Now We Are Free and Honor Him, they're both very minimal, but they sound epic. And that's where the genius of Hans Zimmer lies, in contrast. At number 2 is The Dark Knight. When you think of superhero movies and their scores, you think of horns, strings, big drums, and motifs. But Hans Zimmer took that all out and said, I'll do it my way. For The Dark Knight, Hans Zimmer worked with James Newton Howard to create chaos. This score is unlike anything you have heard in a superhero movie. The whole score revolves around pulsating rhythms, arpeggios, and a single note stretched to its limit. Yes, I'm talking about the infamous Joker theme.
Why so serious? He comes at me with the knife. Why so serious?
Using techniques like the shepherd tone to create an illusion of an endless loop, Hans Zimmer created a score that is full of tension and chaos. The score is unpredictable, it keeps you on the edge, just like the movie. And that is why the Dark Knight trilogy will always stand the test of time, because with these movies, Nolan created a series that does not look like a superhero movie, and Hans Zimmer created a score that does not sound like a superhero score. And the best Hans Zimmer score of all time is Interstellar. When Christopher Nolan first approached Hans Zimmer for the movie Interstellar, he did not reveal that it was a sci-fi opera. He told him it was a story between a father and a son. Hans was deeply moved by the story and it reminded him of his relationship with his son. Therefore, he wrote a very intimate piano piece which became the central theme for the movie. After listening to that musical piece, Nolan revealed that this movie was in fact a sci-fi movie. But instead of scoring it like a traditional sci-fi movie, which would be arpeggios, horns, strings, Hans and Nolan decided that they needed a new sound. So instead of using the typical instruments, they used a pipe organ. Recorded at the London's Temple Church, the pipe organ actually evokes the sense of awe while keeping it deeply human. Listening to this score is almost like a sacred experience. The other pieces of the film are equally astounding, and it also tells you about Hans Zimmer's attention to detail. Remember Miller's Planet? While Coop and Brand are on Miller's Planet, you hear a tick every 1.25 seconds. That tick represents a one full day passed on Earth. This auditory cue serves to heighten the tension and becomes the metronome of cosmic dread. It also keeps the audience on edge and reminds them that the time is running out. Since the release of the film, the score for Interstellar has become one of the most famous scores of all time. You almost hear it every single day on somebody's reel. If John Williams is a genius, then Hans Zimmer is a scientist, because he experimented with different sounds, with different instruments. He even created his own instruments. He created his own textures, and he created scores that were never heard before. Hans Zimmer doesn't just score movies. He creates an immersive experience, and for him the story is always front and center, and the music actually enhances the storytelling. So you tell me in the comments, what are your top 5 Hans Zimmer scores? And if you're loving this series, then press like and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.